Dwayne Beck is a professor emeritus at South Dakota State University and the research manager emeritus at the Dakota Lakes Research Farm. Dwayne, thank you so much for taking the time today.
You're welcome.
So to start, could you tell the audience a little bit about kind of the history of soil and agriculture in the United States and what's kind of led us to this moment?
Well, yeah, I always start with the fact that Europeans came here all along because they had kind of over appropriated the land they had in Europe. And you can go to any of those countries, France or England, and the land right around the castles is always highly degraded. And that's because when they when they had the castle there, they were farming that land, but they were doing tillage and the types of things they still use in Europe for producing food, and they degrade the soils. And then they move someplace else to try to get more land, and eventually you kind of run out. So then we got people that are, some people left Europe and went into where Ukraine is now, in that area around Odessa and whatever. We had people coming from Germany and England going in there at one time, and then people started coming to the U.S. and they're just looking for new land to degrade, basically. And then fairly early on in our lifetime as a country, and a lot of this is in David Montgomery's book, Dirt, but Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, and Jefferson were both farmers, were having a discussion about if the practices they were using were degrading the soils in the eastern seaboard, and if they didn't start to use better methods, that they would have to look to go westward to look for new soils. Well, this is 1797, and in 1803, Jefferson bought Louisiana Purchase and headed west. And the whole area of the Louisiana Purchase was Napoleon was looking to bring slaves in from Haiti to farm all of that to produce food to go back to Europe, until he had the slave rebellion in Haiti, and he gave up on that idea, and he needed the money, so he sold the land. And then we took a little while before we put people in. We had Lewis and Clark come through, which is great because I could read Lewis and Clark's journals and find out what was here before we got here, so to speak. And they actually walked right across the southern part of one of our properties that we farm right now. And so I know what was here. And then we send the homesteaders out here to farm, and a lot of them didn't really know how to farm. We did set up the land grant university systems that were designed to help them, and those have been very successful, but initially not so much so. And a lot of tillage was used. We got the mechanical tractors and those kind of things in the early 30s and or late 20s or teens, and all of a sudden we're doing way more tillage than we should, and we had the Dust Bowl. And I'd like to say that between South Dakota statehood and the Dust Bowl was less than 50 years. So it was kind of scary how fast that happened. And at the same time, the soils were blowing, and the big dust clouds and whatever were happening, the Missouri River was flooding. So it wasn't because necessarily of drought, is that we had screwed up the landscape. And prior to the farmers, we had the fur traders come out, and they killed all the beavers, or most of them. And so that was our water control. Kept all the little streams and whatever, held the water back on the landscape, which really helped the whole landscape. When you take the beaver out, you just destroy the water cycle. So, it was a human caused issue, the Europeans' response to that is to put in big reservoirs. So in the United States, we have all these big dams that are there to control flooding that the beavers would have been doing. And then they try to irrigate out of those dams because they felt they were too dry. And in this area, that's kind of when I entered because they were having trouble making the water go into the soil under their irrigators that they were pumping from the dams. And we found out that if you don't do tillage, the tillage was the culprit there. If we don't do tillage, the water goes in the ground better. Think of your lawn or the the greenway that you go hiking on. You can get a big rain and it doesn't get muddy. But tilled fields and gardens and things that people till do get muddy because you've goofed them up. So we found out we'd be better off. We quit doing tillage, water go in the ground, and we just had to learn how to grow crops and stuff without doing the tillage because all the tradition had been to use tillage as a primary tool there. And we just looked at the natural systems, how they function. And we try to emulate that natural system as much as we can, and still produce crops. So we have a lot of diversity in the system, but it's not necessarily all the diversity isn't in every place all the time. And I don't think it is in natural systems either. You have meadows and you have treed areas. And if you come back in 150 years, those probably have changed places. And so what we're doing is the succession thing. So we have diversity over time, very diverse over time, but not necessarily in a given spot. And so we've been, there's a couple keys there. I think government policy should be focused more on conservation type issues. Right now, it's more of a production oriented thing. In the United States, the research traditionally had been housed in the university, land grant university systems, and they should be less political, but now we have a lot of funding coming from the federal government. So to those universities. So they by default or more prone to being impacted by changes in policy. Dakota Lakes is owned by a group of farmers that got together when we were facing these issues, and instead of having the state of South Dakota buy land for them for the university to do the research, what the farmers did is raise the money to buy the land and furnish that, and they still provide all of the buildings and whatever for doing the research. The component research is done by people from the university, and the system research is done by the folks associated with Dakota Lakes Research Farm.
So you've talked a little bit about the soil and the no-till strategy. Can you talk about why soil is so important and why the low disturbance no-till seeding is important?
Well, soil is, at best, you got 6 inches and maybe a foot of real active soil, and that underneath it is more just substrate, and it holds water and stuff, but the biology is very active in that top 6 inches, and if a lot of the carbon cycles there and such. So if you strip that off, nothing really happens or grows there. And I think all people have kind of seen that. If somebody strips off the top of their lawn or something, it doesn't really grow well underneath. I drove through parts of Minnesota last week, and they still do a lot of tillage, and the tops of their hills now are totally bare of any kind of topsoil. So it's just basically they can't grow anything on the tops anymore because the tillage itself will pull that soil off the top of the hills. So the damage done by the tillage tool itself is very extreme, and the worst example of that is humans with hoes because they always hoe above their feet. So in some of the developing countries that use a hand hoe, their erosion is worse than it is where we would use machines. And so we want to do, we really got our emphasis, our example is the native system. And here our native system is a grassland. And there really isn't any trees, and there's places where there's trees, and as a native vegetation, you handle things differently because those are different systems. But we want to try to cycle the water like the native system did. They never waste any water. They don't waste nutrients. They don't leak things out. When you start doing tillage, people have drain tile and stuff, and they leak things into the rivers, and we got water quality problems in the rivers. And in the native system, you really don't have any of that. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do. We just look at native systems, say, how can we do those kind of things, have those kind of impacts, those kind of results, and still produce some of the crops we need, like canola or peas. We grow, chickpeas and peas and canola and corn and sorghum and wheat, a couple kinds of wheat and oats. So we grow this real diversity of things, which is typical of a native system to have a lot of diversity. But we can harvest grain and let people use that. We can also raise livestock, which we do. And that's probably the best end product, is to have the livestock, because they cycle almost all the nutrients. If we sell wheat to Egypt, for instance, the nutrients involved in that wheat go away and they don't come back. And so we have to use some fertilizer to keep things cycled. If I run it through a cow, almost all of it cycles back to the land. One of the interesting ones is our oil crops, soybeans and flax and canola, for instance. We press the oil out of the seeds, which gives us oil and meal. The meal we use in our livestock feed. All the nutrients basically are in the meal. The oil has no nutrition. We eat a lot of oil as humans, but there's no nutrition there. There's energy, but oil is just carbohydrate. And what that really is carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. So Mother Nature will bring me back sunlight tomorrow. Every day we get sunlight, we get water on a somewhat regular basis, and we have carbon dioxide comes floating back through here too. So I don't have to transport things back to the farm to replace the oil. If I sell the meal or sell the grain, I have to, there's some transportation both ways there. So those are some interesting aspects of why we're doing what we're doing, is to try to emulate that natural system.
Yeah, another thing I wanted to ask you about was the how you implement rotations, or the diverse rotations that you implement. How is that done, and why is that important?
Well, the way it is done is we go through a whole bunch of steps of what we're trying to get done. You got to determine what you're trying to do or what you're trying to help do. I've done over the years, I've done very extensive rotation studies and compared 50 different types of ways of doing things. But the thing we look at is we want to match the water and nutrient cycles of the native system. So that's first thing. How much in a wet wet environment, you have to have something growing all the time. In some of our drier environments, our grass will go dormant for whiles in summer because it's too dry. But we got to try to, use all the water like Mother Nature did. And then we want to be unpredictable enough that we don't give opportunities to weeds and diseases and such. And if you're unpredictable enough, Mother Nature, the past people talk about in farming are not really pests, they're just opportunists. And so if you go to a native system, it doesn't have a lot of pests. It might have some things that are a pest, but there's a predator that eats them or something, never really gets up to a point of economic concern. And that's the way we handle most of what we have. We haven't used an insecticide in 20 years or over 20 years. Because if we spray an insecticide, then we would kill our predator insects as well, and then you actually create more of a problem. So we look at those things. How can we alter the sequence? Which crop follows which crop in the interval? How long between crop A and when A comes back again? And 2 weeks ago today, I had some Ukrainian farmers here, and they were initially pretty skeptical. And we went through a whole bunch of our fields, and I ended at 2 wheat fields that are in one of our dryland rotations. And I invited them to go walk in the fields and then come back and confer with each other, because we were talking through a translator, and come up with what they thought I had to use to have the kind of crop I had there, because it's getting close to harvest. And they have this whole list of stuff they thought I had used to kill bugs and whatever, and to keep the weeds out, because they couldn't find any weeds and couldn't find any bugs, and they were sure I'd dosed it with something. The thing I'd done is just done a good job of rotational planning and putting in crops that are competitive with weeds, understanding like if I grow a crop, there'll be a weed that maybe makes it there. It's not going to harm anything, but it's going to go to seed. What can I put there next year that would be able to outcompete those seeds because it starts to grow earlier or it grows later in the year or something? So we use that, what I call competition, and sanitation means steps we take to not have weeds get introduced, like cleaning our equipment between fields and things like that. If you pick up a weed seed in one field, you don't want to drag it to another one. So we have all these little techniques that we use, housekeeping things. And that's all we'd really use, because we hadn't used an herbicide, we hadn't used an insecticide, and we hadn't used a fungicide of any type in those 2 fields since they were planted. We did spray a herbicide in the fall before we planted to kill anything that was there, but other than that, we hadn't used anything, and we didn't use anything that had any residual. So it was just kind of what we call a burn down, and that was it. So it so, and then you got to look at profitability. So there's things that we do that maybe aren't as good in terms of, we may have to use a bit more, maybe have to use an herbicide in crop or something in order to make a bit more money. But it's not like the rotations that are the most common in the United States are ones that are very predictable and very low in diversity. And so we have a huge amount of use of pesticides just simply because we're not smart enough to think like a bug or a virus or whatever. So we just avoid the problem, and we've written several things on that. If you go to our website, they're there on how to plan those things. Everybody's personality is different. And so most people, once they get good at this, will use rotations that differ slightly, which is fine. I had a guy that didn't want to grow soybeans because he would have to harvest them during elk hunting season. So that's okay. I mean, that's a reason, but it's an art, and farmers are incredibly good at this. That's the thing that's fun, is the scientists that I work with aren't as good at thinking through that as farmers, because farmers are more systems people. They're used to looking at the whole system and not at the component. And scientists and engineers especially are taught to narrow everything down. See, and what we're really doing is expanding the thought process out.
Hmm. Well, the last question I want to ask you is, what do you see as the future of farming? What do you see on the horizon?
Well, I'm not sure. I thought when I started, Dakota Lakes has been here since 1990, and we've never done tillage. And it's basically in our mission statement that we're just, we're going to do things, but we don't have it in there that we can't do tillage. It's just that we don't think it's a good thing to do. So we're not going to do tillage. And the farmer board that helped me operate, they're all down with that. They're all no-tillers now, but when we started, they weren't. I think we're going to have to quit doing tillage, so we quit degrading the soil. So I think that's a given, but that's a bigger ask than I thought it was going to be. There's going to be more technology, but hopefully we don't take the human out, because the high tech and the AI and whatever are all they're all within parameters, and nature is not limited by those parameters. There's an analog computer and a digital computer. And the digital computers is what the technology is, and they're very, very good at remembering things, but they're god awful at making decisions. The analog computer between your ears is really bad at remembering things, but it's really good. It's really good at making decisions and integrating things. And the thing they haven't really gotten done that they need to get done is to somehow improve the communication between the analog computer and the digital computers. And they continue to try to make the digital computers better at making decisions. And I'm not sure they're going to get there because they can't go outside the box. And a lot of the progress that we made was because we were outside the box. Because we went out in nature and looked at what she was doing. She was outside the box. But yeah, we have a huge number of predators here. And so insects that come in don't really have a chance, because we don't give them a chance to build populations. And because we don't have a consistent, I mean, I give a lot of examples, but being consistent with sequence or interval gets you an insect or a weed every time. If you're consistently doing the same thing over and over and over again, Mother Nature will find somebody to fit in there. See, if you, Mother Nature, one of my favorite statements that my wife doesn't like me to say, but Mother Nature is not a B word. She's an opportunist. And so if you have a pest of some sort, or something that isn't working the way you want it to be, you have to figure out where you provided the opportunity, and not start off immediately by running someplace and say, I want something that'll kill it. That's not the right answer. Get to understand its life habits, what it does, and then take that opportunity away. I mean, the best example of the opportunistic thing is the corn rootworm, that should only impact fields that were planted in corn year after year. But farmers were doing corn, soybean, corn, soybean, corn, soybean, and the corn rootworm developed a way to get around that, because it didn't have corn plants the next year to eat on, right? So one subspecies developed eggs that didn't hatch for 2 years, and one subspecies created the habit of flying from the cornfield to the soybean field to lay their eggs because they knew they were going to put corn there the next year.
Wow.
But they didn't know that. They didn't know either of those things. But Mother Nature has that diversity in her genetics. So every beetle that lays eggs has some that hatch year one, some that hatch year two, and some that hatch year three. And so if you're consistently doing something, that variation is going to be successful.
Hmm.
And some of the beetles just flew off to the soybean fields to lay eggs, and then that was the one that was successful. That's how success, that's how adaptation works. And then whatever, they were the ones that were successful. You developed a whole species that has that habit, or subspecies. And all you have to do is be less predictable. And I had somebody here a few weeks ago, and I was kind of in a hurry, and we were looking around, trying to be nice. And they asked me a question about what's going in this field next, and I had to kind of sit and think about it. Well, that's a good thing, because if I have to think about it to figure it out, then the bugs will never figure it out.
Yeah.
It's
Hmm. Well, Dwayne, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and for sharing your insights and your research and your wisdom. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
my pleasure. Thank you.